Intel also reported results. Shares are falling in the after-hour session. Bloomberg intelligence analyst Anand Srinivasan covers the chip makers. He is joining us now, and still with us is Leigh Drogen as well, founder and CEO of Estimize, an open financial estimates platform. Anand, your impressions thus far of those Intel numbers?
Look, we've been saying this, that the data center market and even the PC market is not a zero-sum game where we think that Intel and AMD can both do well and benefit from a growing market, particularly in the data center. So the data center group did really well, both from a revenue perspective and its impact from an operating margin perspective. PCs are doing okay. They had good quarter numbers for Q2. They had good guidance for Q3, and they raised full-year forecast. So across the board, this is a good quarter. Now, you have to preface that from an expectation standpoint.
Yes.
AMD printed last night, and AMD just had, blew the cover off the ball. So on a relative basis, maybe expectations are a little mismatched, but remember that Intel has 98.5% share, for example, in the data center market, and AMD has 1.5, so AMD has more room to grow.
And AMD has a market cap of $18 billion, whereas Intel $243 billion. So completely different scales.
Absolutely.
I hear what you're saying about how AMD kind of set expectations really high, but if you look at how Intel shares performed today, they were down by 0.5%. So it's not like they had got a big run-up following AMD or people were re-rating it, were they?
Look, I think that there's this notion still that every share point of loss for Intel is AMD's gain or vice versa. But you have to remember that the cloud market is expanding dramatically. Corporate IT spending, I heard our guest speakers speak earlier, that's also expanding. So the market is expanding in total, and Intel's going to grow with that market, albeit a little perhaps lower than the market. Now, AMD is going to gain disproportionate amount of share, given that they were absent in the data center market for 7 years. So you have a lot of room for AMD's growth. So for the first time in a long time, we at Bloomberg Intelligence think that we like all three companies, the love triangle between AMD, NVIDIA, and Intel. We like all three for totally different reasons.
Your view on the chips?
Yeah, I mean, I look at this as a traders want beta right now. We're trading above a rising 200-day moving average. Market's pretty healthy. Tech earnings have been great. You're going to want AMD over Intel right now in a market where it's a relatively risk-on market.
In terms of the stocks, Abigail was talking about this earlier, how the semiconductor index, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, has been very volatile this year. How have the estimates looked for all these different chip makers? Have they been moving around a lot as well?
You know what's really interesting is that we're actually not in one secular cycle here, or we're not at the same point in each cyclical cycle for each name. They're kind of offset at this point, which is really interesting. You're looking at stuff like Ambarella, where they've had a really down cycle recently, but they're actually at the nadir now, and they've got some chips that are going into some optical stuff. They've got some really interesting chips now where we're starting to see estimates for the out quarters start to rise, and you usually want to be investing in those names about 2 quarters before the nadir of that cycle. For some of the other names that are, the server space, we've obviously seen, a really big run in those, and so maybe it's time to start rotating into the other ones.
Interesting.
I want to bring up the CEO issue with Intel as well, to get back to Intel specifically. And Anand, we've talked about Brian Krzanich stepping down as CEO because of a relationship with a colleague. Who could come in and take? I mean, there's been some talk about potentially a female CEO. We're showing two former Intel executives, and then Lisa Su, who has seen enormous success at AMD.
So look, I mean, Intel is a very different beast. I love Lisa Su. She's done fantastic things at AMD, and she is a very, very key operator at the company. That said, I think Renee and Diane have significant experience at Intel and significant experience running large chipmaker operations. I think that's a very different ballgame than running AMD, number one. Number two, I think one name that's missing from that list is Stacy Smith.
Not a woman, by the way.
The former CFO, right?
Former CFO, former manufacturing exec, former sales exec. So he's had a tremendous amount of experience, and both Renee, Diane, and Stacy all left following Brian Krzanich's ascension to CEO. So I think that those three names are at the top of my list. Lisa, as fantastic as she is, I would put her in the second bucket.
Perhaps a different ball game because of the size of the company.